So our speaker tonight is Dr. March Snell from Sandia National Laboratory, where he works on national security issues. He has a PhD in operations research from Cornell University, and he's a member of Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Albuquerque, and he is interested in both history and theology, and so he has combined them in this talk on the Scopes trial. One thing I forgot to say before I put it out, our next talk is going to be on April 23, and it's going to be Dr. Bill Stone from Tech, and he is going to be speaking on wisdom, literature, and today. So I'd encourage you all to show up for that. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's important for me to say in front of a academic audience like this that I don't have any professional training in theology or in biology, so I'm a layman here in both senses. I guess the other comment I'd like to make is we have been helped out by this Science and Faith series down here with speakers many times in Albuquerque, so I really appreciate the opportunity to come back and return the favor, and hopefully you'll think the same way at the end of this talk here. I usually give shorter speeches or talks than this, so we'll see how it goes as far as the discussion. One reason I bring that up is if you have any questions, feel free to jump in there and ask them as we go along, because it will probably bring up some points. So with that, I'm going to get into our presentation here. This is Moving Beyond Monkey Business, Examining the Science and Theology Behind the Scopes Trial. One of the things I did when we started up our series is I started thinking of topics that might be interesting. And the Scopes trial was one of these hot button things from the past that I decided to look at. But more recently, I started looking into the famous or infamous Huxley-Wilberforce discussion after The Origin of Species came out, and a lot of that is fanciful too. And if one looks at paleontology in general, there appear to be these fairy stories that are told. So I'm not sure, which area is more mythical. There seem to be a lot of myths, certainly, when it comes to evolutionary theory. What you see on the left here is a picture of Clarence Darrow, who was a very famous lawyer in the early 20th century. There's the John Scopes, who was the center of attention in the trial, and William Jennings Bryan. And I don't know how much you know about some of these folks, but William Jennings Bryan, very famous guy, ran for president 3 times, was actually, when I give this in the Presbyterian Church, I can talk about how he was a bigwig in the Presbyterian Church. He was almost our moderator one time back in the 20s, so he had a big effect on Christianity in the U.S. in the early 20th century. He actually, in the 1880s, I think it was, he made his notoriety with the free silver movement. I don't know if anybody here ever heard about that, but the West became very upset when the U.S. government decided to go to the gold standard. And he had a famous statement, something to the effect that they shall not crucify man on a cross of gold. So the cross of gold was always connected with him. So one reason I bring this up is these people in this little town of Dayton, Tennessee, these towering people in their own areas come in to have this trial. So it's almost like having the heavyweight championship of the world in your little town, which was pretty astounding to the people who were around there. So let me move on here and talk about this a little bit. What I thought I would do here is start out by giving you the overview of the Scopes trial, just the facts here. I'll talk a little bit about the law under which Thomas Scopes was indicted. And what I like to do is talk about the fiction versus truth of the case, because that's the most amusing part. But beyond that, I'd like to go into what William Jennings Bryan proposed closing speech was, because he was never allowed to give it. And so many people who've seen the movie Inherit the Wind don't realize that there were two sides to the discussion. I'll go on to talk about what the defense had to say when they appealed the conviction of Mr. Scopes, because that brought up a number of interesting things. But there was a sort of like a behind the news or backstory side of this whole trial that I wanted to bring up. There were some issues with evolution during that period of time, and some of those are actually interesting to see how they interplayed with this particular trial. Another thing I put in here is many people think in terms of you have creationists and then you have, everybody else, or evolutionists versus creationists, and it turns out there's a whole spectrum of positions that I was going to go over there. It really is illuminated in my own mind by this trial. And then I'll give a summary here. What I like to do, just because I'll get going, is if somebody can give me a notice when I'm down to 10 minutes, I'll try to make sure I wrap it up. So I don't know if you can read that or not. These are just how is that doing in the back? Is it good? Okay, I wasn't sure how much it was an eye chart, because sometimes I get it on a screen. But basically it was known as the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, and it basically occurred in 1925. And here what happened was a high school teacher, John Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach human evolution in any state-funded school. So that was the issue. Now, after an 8-day trial, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100, but the verdict was overturned. And as we say here, William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times and never made it, argued for the prosecution, while Clarence Darrow, the famed defense attorney, and one of his claims to fame is he never had a defendant executed. That's what he said. He spoke for Scopes, defended him. And it was seen commonly as a case of theological versus scientific. So fundamentalist versus modernist, or creation versus evolution controversy. So this is sort of the background of the whole thing. And here's an example. Here's the law under which he was indicted. Section 1 is the important thing. It should be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities, normals, and other public schools which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. So one of the interesting things here is the law itself had nothing to do with evolution in general. It had everything to do with the evolution of mankind in specific. So this is one of those things where you say, okay, that's not what I heard when I saw some of these other renditions of the case. Now, I think we all can figure out where this came from. This is basically an issue with what evolution has to say about the story in Genesis and where people came from. And did we all come from the garden, or did we come from, somebody's grandfather was an ape or something like that, however they want to describe it. So basically the indictment against him basically said, Mr. Scopes did teach instead thereof that man has descended from a lower order of animals. And so that basically was the issue here. If you stand back and look at it, what should have been tried in the case should have lasted about 20 minutes. Did he teach it or not? And the fact was, you could get a whole bunch of kids who said, you know what, he did X, Y, Z. And so it became actually one of these early cases that you could call a media trial, because it was a circus and all this type of stuff, which was interesting. Now, let me go back here a little bit and talk about this trial in general. One of the questions one might have is, why this particular case and why at this particular time? And that's an interesting thing to go back and look at. In the early 20th century, what one would call fundamentalists, and we'll talk about that later, only about that time did they really get upset about evolution. And it really came down to this whole issue eventually of two things coming together. One was Darwinian thought and evolution, but the other one was basically the new type of biblical criticism that showed up in Germany in the 19th century, which was trying to look at the Bible historically rather than from a theological perspective. And many of the people saw, like William Jennings Bryan, saw these two things almost like from different ends of the spectrum corrupting the youth. And so the whole point here was, we're going to keep this stuff out of the schools because it's going to corrupt the youth to do this. So William Jennings Bryan actually was the one who started pushing the law that we talked about here. But it was his intent at the time not to fine anybody anything. It was just to say you shouldn't be able to do this. Now, what was interesting about this case also is they had been using the same textbook for years, civic biology for years, and there had been no problem. But that particular year, somebody decided, it would be really cool to have some event here that would draw people to Dayton, Tennessee. Because if they come here, they'll buy stuff, they'll stay in the hotels, literally. So people said, well, there's this law, and Mr. Scopes, would you be willing to let us put you down as a defendant in this? And in one thing that I read, I don't know if this is true, but they were saying he was actually a substitute teacher at the time that section was being covered. So he wasn't really the full biology instructor at the time. So there's a whole bunch of stuff behind this which is really sort of amusing. So apparently the trial was a success because the hotels were overflowed with people and the restaurants did very well and everybody had a great time, except the downside of all this is about 5 or 6 days later that William Jennings Bryan died of a apparent heart attack. That was the downside of it. But up until then, people were doing very well with it. Now, there was a guy named Mencken. I don't know if you know about him. He had a very caustic pen, and he was actually covering the case. So I haven't looked at his stuff, but that's one thing that basically was involved in all this. The other thing I like about it is now there's so many things that are on the internet that you can just go look them up. So you can go and look up civic biology. I have a page out of it that I'll show you later. You can look up the court case. You can look up the appeal. You can look up all these things that William Jennings Bryan wrote about this type of stuff. So it's really sort of cool. So I don't know if anybody here has seen Inherit the Wind. Okay, apparently, long time.
Yeah.
Read the book, okay. What's interesting about it is it was written in the 50s or something like that, and it really was a product of its time, almost like a reaction to McCarthyism, but it was using the Scopes trial as sort of the foil or whatever you might want to call it. So the fiction here is that there was an attempt when they made that film to faithfully portray the trial. And the fact of the matter is the people who even wrote the play, there was not intended to be any accuracy in rendering that. It turns out, I was reading today that when they made a movie of this, it was opened in Dayton, Tennessee on the 35th anniversary of the Scopes trial. So somebody obviously was linking those two. The thing that you see in the movie, the focus of it, is Clarence Darrow's questioning of William Jennings Bryan. Now, of course, they use different names in there, but a lot of the verbiage was taken from the Scopes trial. But the reality is the actual trial itself lasted 8 days, so there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Some of it just sort of being legal procedures, but some of it being actually interesting testimony. Though if you watch the film and so forth, it looks like Darrow's side won the argument through the question he had of William Jennings Bryan, because that's the focus of the movie. But the fact of the matter is, you come to find out this was all one way. Questioning of Darrow was never allowed. It turned out that on the last day of the trial, the 7th day of the trial, basically Darrow called Bryan to speak to the witness stand and talked about the Bible and all this type of stuff. And it was the intention the next day that they could do this the other way. There could be cross-examination, so to speak. Well, the next day, basically, Darrow said, we don't really have anything to contest, so we'll just admit our guy is guilty. And so Bryan never got a chance to sort of give his side of the story, which, to my mind, was sort of interesting. So if you watch the movie, it was a morality play. Darrow won the case for reason and science and prevented the descent into barbarity. So, this was going to be like the Mongols coming for the second time and driving the world down. Now, the fact of the matter was Scopes was found guilty, and many more states out there had laws like this for decades. For those of us who are old enough, you realize it was a Supreme Court case back in the 60s, by which they said there had to be, quote-unquote, separation of church and state. Before that time, there wasn't a clear delineation of that, so laws like this were on the books. It was believed that legislatures representing people were able to decide that there should be certain things their children are taught and certain things that they're not, whether or not it's scientific or not. That was at least the view at the time. It's actually interesting to look at the appeals court decision with respect to these claims, because it lays out a viewpoint that I think many people, even myself, don't realize what the whole view of the times were back then. By golly, if you didn't want it in the school, it wasn't there. When I was actually a little kid, there were still places where they censored books. You couldn't get them in the library and that sort of thing, and that was what people thought was just fine. Actually, in the movie and the play, and I have a copy of the stuff here, Bryan is laid out to be what's called a six-day creationist, and we'll talk about what that is. But basically, he's portrayed as wanting to protect faith more than teach science. And some of you know Mr. Dershowitz, who's the lawyer. He said Bryan was no simple-minded literalist. I think that's a good way of putting it. We'll talk later about what he had to say. And they, of course, in the movie, to make it dramatic, he died during the trial. And actually, Bryan died several days after the trial. The outcome of both of these, though, was William Jennings Bryan was not able to give his side of the outcome of the case. And so Darrow spent a lot of time telling everybody about how he had won the case, and there was nobody around to basically call him on it. So he did have a closing speech that was never presented, and they actually published it. And you could find this, I can't remember which book I got it from. So I was going to go over this a little bit to sort of give you Bryan's side of the whole thing. From his perspective, the law is not trying to force any form of religion on anybody, but to keep children from being taught irreligion in publicly funded schools. So basically the idea was sort of a flip side of what we see right now. We have this separation of church and state, and like intelligent design, you can't teach it because it's theological. Well, back then it was, well, if you think this is going to corrupt the youth, then you don't have a right to teach it. And so what basically Brian said was, if you want to teach man is descended from an ape, you can open up your own atheist schools and teach that in your atheist school. So it's like flip-flop from today when people talk about parochial schools. Evolution is merely a hypothesis. He points out that with 2 or 3 million species, it's been impossible to trace any species to any other species. Now this is an interesting thing. I don't know if people have studied evolutionary theory back in the early 20th century and so forth. I don't want to speak here to somebody who's an expert in the audience, but it was not until you had what was called the modern synthesis back in the 1940s and 50s that all this stuff came together, like Mendelian genetics and the paleontology and Darwinian thought. And so actually at the time of the Scopes trial, the whole area was a muddle scientifically. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but people at that time could not figure out how you take genetics, which either has features or doesn't, and looks like something that's an on-off binary quantum type thing, and it's not clear how you take that and make species that change over time. So some of the things that actually Brian was quoting from biologists were actually people who disagreed with Darwin on how evolution worked. So from that perspective, Brian was not manipulating information. He was actually reporting the scientific discord at the time. One of his points here was there's nothing to stop anybody from teaching evolution up to the line that separates man and animals. So if people want to say that basically land animals came from fish or whatever, go ahead and do it. That was one of his points. There was just one area where they felt like there's no need to teach that. The concern he had is, how are children going to feel if you start lumping them in with animals? And one of the points he made is, in his own mind, he linked this idea with what happened in the First World War. If people are just sort of like animals, then you can do things like dump gas on them and use artillery, and there's a whole moral argument here that we were sort of, the neighborhood was going to heck, so to speak, by talking about people being in the same category as animals. And of course, one of the important things here is it disputes the truth of the biblical account of man's creation and shakes faith in the Bible as the Word of God. And that was one of the issues that he was very concerned about at the time. Actually, basically, as I'll talk about later, William Jennings Bryan was one of the important figures in what was originally the fundamentalist community in the early 20th century. So it was really very illuminating to have his thoughts on this. And a few more points that he made. Belief in evolution cannot bring to those who hold such a belief any compensation for the loss of faith in God, trust in the Bible, and belief in the supernatural character of Christ. And he actually, he quotes this guy who was a biologist in the late 19th century who basically had gone from being a Christian to an atheist, and this person had said this very thing. His whole attitude was, well, he had lost his faith in God and there was no way for him to get it back, but he really had that sort of like theological purpose in life that had been taken from him, and he really felt like it had been a loss. So he wasn't making this up completely. His view was people needed a heavenly vision so that especially if you're going to universities and things like that, you have a moral responsibility to benefit society. And so taking someone's religion away from them, he felt was actually going to be a disbenefit to society. If you look at all religions, basically, they see problems with humanity. In Christianity, it's because mankind is a fallen person, and therefore we need to be saved. But other religions have their own view of what's wrong and how to fix it. And his point here was, if you believe in evolution, the only program to make people better as a society and as a species is through scientific breeding, which in his viewpoint is a repugnant type of thing. Yes, sir?
Why didn't he present this speech?
He was not allowed to. Because the day that he was, if you go back and read the account, it's like Darrow was questioning him, and it's like the judge said, "Oh, 4 o'clock or whenever it is, time's up, we'll come back in the morning." And in the morning, it's like, we're not going to do this anymore. And basically, Darrow said, I'll just admit right now my defendant is guilty, and so let's shut this whole thing down. So Darrow really cut off the presentation of it. Weird. Any other questions on that? So it was interesting.
Yeah, I have a question about
Yes,
the
sir.
same issue. What was Brian's legal role in this trial? He was not the prosecutor himself, right?
You bring up a very interesting point. He was not the counsel or the prosecutor per se.
Right.
What happened here was there was a lowly prosecutor from that particular area, and the ACLU got wind of this thing, and so they were going to send a lawyer, and Clarence Darrow heard about it, and he decided he would come and help out, which upset the ACLU that he was doing it, so he, in a sense, commandeered the defense side, and so that's when William Jennings Bryan said, "I'm going to get into the act," and sort of...
So neither one of them were technically the advocates for one side or the other in a legal sense.
I think technically Darrow ended up being the counsel for the defense.
Because that might be a reason why he couldn't be examined, forced to testify.
That's true, but I think at the same time it was highly irregular. People said that Bryan would be interrogated too. So the whole thing, that's why I say it was like a media circus. But you're exactly right. That was, if this had just been a more normal trial, William Jennings Bryan would not have been there at all. Any other points on that? Okay. The interesting thing here, I don't know if I'll have time to go into it, but there's the term he uses, this theory eliminates love. And there's a whole discussion which I'll get into later. But basically there's a section in Descent of Man, it's a book by Darwin, where he basically bemoans the fact that by keeping people around who otherwise would have died off, we're actually going downhill as a species. We're de-evolving, so we're deselecting, if you will. And from Brian's perspective, that is an unloving way to look at your poor people or your people who aren't medically well off and so forth. One of the issues that came up with was Nietzsche. Without going into it, he felt that part of what was wrong with Germany in the First World War was they were seizing on this idea of certain people being Superman, which is something the Nazis got in World War II, but I'm not sure it was there in World War I. And basically this was, this whole idea of being superior allowed them to go out and kill millions of people on their part. There's an interesting link here, though. There was there were two brothers who engaged, who were like teenagers, and they were, one of them was a teenager, the other one was in college. And they basically went out and killed somebody and got some like junior high school kid and killed him in cold blood. And basically the reason they did it was one of them said he had been reading this stuff about Nietzsche and so forth. And it was actually Clarence Darrow that pleaded for this guy's life, and of course he got it because he wasn't executed. And his statement was, "It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university." So Darrow was one of the first people who said, you know, I'm the victim of a social disease or something like that. It's not my fault. It's due to Nietzsche that this murder happened. And that was something that Brian really thought was a terrible idea. Now there was sort of, because there were so many theatrics that were going on in the trial itself, not a lot of information came out. One of the things that did come out when I was reading about it was early on, basically Darrow tried to introduce all this testimony about evolution, and so they actually had one fellow get up and talk about evolutionary theory, and they had like about 5 or 6 different people submit, I don't know, testimonials or whatever you might want to call it on that particular thing. And one of the points they were trying to make at that time, and they also made in the defense at the appeal, was there's nothing necessarily inconsistent between the Bible as interpreted by scholars in evolution and the theory of evolution in Christianity. And their point was the court excluded all this testimony. So the ironic thing here, in my view, is when people look at this case as being a battle between science and faith, one of the big defense positions was that there is no problem between science and faith. So it's sort of like, okay, and you just sort of deflated my balloon there, but that was actually one of the points. Now there were certain things that they pointed out. They felt this was unconstitutional because it was giving religious preference by saying those particular Protestant sects which believe in the literal acceptance of the story of creation, this type of training was better for them as opposed to sects that don't see it that particular way. And one of the points in the trial was basically, are we talking about the King James Version, or are we talking about another version? If you stand back and look in our time frame, in a place in Tennessee, the concept that you might be looking at non-Christian religions at all was really sort of a foreign concept, like the back of the moon.
Or Catholics.
Right, that's right. Specifically, it forbids the teaching of a doctrine in the public schools contrary to the particular doctrine which is the foundation of the literal religious establishment. So basically, the idea here is instead of separation of church and state, the idea here is the anti-disestablishmentarianism, which says you can't have one religion preferred over the other, which was the early interpretation of that amendment.
Yeah, another point too, which seems to be pretty obvious, but it hasn't been mentioned, and that is there's a definite delineation between teaching something like, say, algebra or chemistry, where this is truth as far as we know it, or teaching something like Marxist philosophy, saying this is what the philosophy is, but it's not, we aren't endorsing it. And they're assuming that if you teach a theory, you're presenting it as undisputed truth.
Right. And I think that's exactly right. The whole issue of can I teach something without saying I personally endorse it is an important factor. I think, to be fair, Williams Jennings Bryan has basically said the fact that you're even bringing it up is giving it credibility in people's minds. I disagree with that opinion, but yeah, you make a very good point about that. There were a number of legal things. They didn't feel like the crime was sufficiently particular, all this type of stuff. What they were hoping to do, well, let me just talk some more. Let's see. This was the stuff that got sort of, I think they went a little bit over the top, because they had things like the second one down. We will come to a tragic end where bigots light faggots, and with flaming banners and beating drums we march back to the glorious ages of medievalism. That seems to me to be a little bit excessive in terms of what was brought out here. But anyway, there were some things like that. Gradually, through the elimination of the teaching of anything contrary to the views of particular sects, as learning and science becomes subject to the test of church doctrine, our public education will become a fraud. Now, of course, it's really sort of hard to imagine this back in those days, because people were teaching all sorts of religion in the schools and so forth, and it didn't seem to bring the world down at the time. But I guess that's a matter of opinion. If this statute is valid, and little by little the Bible and a literal interpretation thereof can be made the standard of knowledge and accuracy for every work of science. That seems to me to be perhaps a little bit excessive, but I'll let you decide about that. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about what was going on in that time. There was a big concern about bad evolutionary effects. There were what were called eugenics laws at the time. Now, some of us who are Star Trek fans remember eugenics, the eugenics wars. So I heard that term before, but I wasn't really sure where it came from. Well, back in those particular times, the issue was not making people better, which is what you saw in Star Trek, but the whole issue was that the world was going downhill because we were people who were frail and feeble-minded and things like that were basically procreating, and the smart people were not procreating enough. And there was actually a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, that opened this whole issue was brought up. And there's a famous statement out of that to the effect that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, and which basically allowed them to sterilize people. And from 1909, when this started up, to 1927, they had 9,000 people who were forcibly sterilized, and up until 1939, 30,000 people were. And I think it was 1927 when that particular Buck versus Bell happened. So a lot of people were affected. A little bit of personal disclosure here. I suffer from epilepsy. If I had lived back at that time, the laws on the books would say I would be forced to be sterilized. The other thing that came up here, which was interesting, was not only was it the feeble-minded, but there was this concern that somehow that people overseas were not as biologically well off as people here, so that they were using excuses like this to keep immigrants out, and it's unclear what effect that had on immigration. So it was sold to the public, as I say here, based on eugenics concerns, but there was also, I think, some racial concerns too. I think one thing it's important for people to recognize when we think about race is back in those times, 90% plus of the population were white. And for many people, they had never seen a black person or anybody from Asia or any of that other stuff. So that's one of the reasons why this racial stuff came up, because people were talking about basically myths about other people. One of the issues was sterilizing people for feeble-mindedness, which I'll talk about. Also, many of the people who were sterilized were women. There was one case that I remember reading about where they decided to sterilize this woman because she was feeble-minded, and she went on to college or some other thing after the whole thing. So the whole basis of it seemed to have been very strange. The other bad effect of evolutionary thought was social Darwinism. And this was not something that Darwin supported per se, but there were some people, there was a guy named Spencer at the time, who took this survival of the fittest and said, you know, you really, to make the economy better off, you can't be fettering business by having all these labor laws. So this was one of the reasons why William Jennings Bryan, who was a member of the Democratic Party, which was a labor party, this is one reason why he opposed it. What's interesting about this whole thing is that there was a positive correlation between approval of sterilization for eugenics with the liberality of the religious party. So it was the more conservative churches, the Catholics and so forth, who opposed eugenics laws. And some of the other more liberal churches thought this was a good idea because it was, that's what the scientists said. So it was sort of an interesting thing here to see how the theology played out. This was also before the time that they had figured out how genetics worked. So you ended up with things like this. This is actually something I copied out of the civic biology book, where in this particular case you have a normal person, that's an N. The A here is somebody who's an alcoholic. And basically they have a number of normal children, but look down there. You've got some Fs, and those are feeble-minded people. So the circles are the women and the squares on the men. I don't know whether one is better than the other, but you can see just from these few cases here, all of these Fs down here at the bottom, all of the failures and feeble-mindedness people are taking over the world. That was sort of what you were reading. This is what high school kids were seeing in their school book. I think if look this sort of thing up, because it's sort of interesting what you find if you actually read through it. It's sort of scary.
Can you comment on the usage of the term feeble-mindedness in that era and what they meant by it?
Well, see, it was not really well defined, and so sometimes if people, it was almost. I should probably state, because I'm not sure I can do it in an easy way, but it was sort of like if you got the impression that this person was not very smart, then you could put them in that category. So if somebody has gone to the university, they're probably not feeble-minded, right? Because they had to get through school. But imagine somebody who's a day laborer who only went to third grade. It might be easy for somebody to decide that they're feeble-minded because they can't tell you what the circumference of the world is or something like that. And I think that was one of the issues that you had. So in this case, they were actually tying together things like being feeble-minded with being an alcoholic. And so it says here at the bottom, the right side of the chart shows a terrible record of feeble-mindedness. Should feeble-minded people be allowed to marry? That's the big question. And it says here, based on, it went back so many years, this one woman who was feeble-minded ended up with 24 confirmed drunkards, 3 epileptic, and 143 feeble-minded descendants. The man who started this terrible line of immorality and feeble-mindedness later married a normal Quaker girl. Now from this couple, a line of 496 descendants have come with no cases of feeble-mindedness. So the evidence and the morals speak for themselves. So just imagine that you're reading this as a high school student. And they talk about parasitism and its cost to society. The remedy, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. So this was, see, to me this is sort of an interesting thing. When you start poking the history book, so to speak, you start learning about this type of stuff. So that was sort of the trial. What I thought I would go into here a little bit was the view William Jennings Bryan had. Because there was concern with some of the historical criticism that ended up being considered very liberal, in the early 20th century they came up with this concept. There was actually a book, I can't remember the name of it. Basically it had to do with fundamentals, and there were 5 fundamentals. One was that the Bible was inspired and inerrant. The second was there was the virgin birth of Christ. The third was that Christ's death was an atonement for sin, that Christ was resurrected, that his miracles occurred. Those were the basic tenets of original fundamentalism. And I remember the first time I looked at this, and I said to myself, from my perspective, coming up as I do in a Christian background, the bodily resurrection of Christ is basically part of what I've been taught to believe. You almost have to go back to Gnostic times to believe that it didn't actually happen. Of course, we can have that discussion here if we like. When back at the time when this was written, the virgin birth of Christ was an issue, but I would argue right now we have thousands of virgin births a year. It's something called, artificial insemination or whatever, right? Depending on what you're doing. So one of the big hot button things here really comes down to this inerrancy of the Bible, and that was actually the topic on which Darrow was really poking William Jennings Bryan, because he was trying to get him to say this part of the Bible isn't true. And that's why you end up with some of the very unusual questions. So what I thought I would do here, we've got a couple minutes left. After I put this talk together, I said, it probably would make some sense to look at how people have looked at some of these issues from different perspectives. You can look at sort of this spectrum from creationists down to atheists, looking at a number of topics. And so you have people, these are the ones you read about, day-agers, where the earth was created 4,000 years ago. And typically for them, evolution is, if there is anything like that, is all guided by God. Up here. Evolution is a lie, 24 hours. Basically, the fall that you read about in the Bible, when I say news there, it's like you read the Albuquerque Journal in the morning. All the miracles are true, resurrection happened, and there's a belief in an ultimate moral law. And as you move away from that, you get people who are day-agers. And so in this particular case, these are people who say a day could be 10,000 years or 1,000,000 years. And so this is where you get your intelligent design people. Much of evolution is driven by God because intelligent design, nature can't do it by itself. This is still news. Everything is all true. The second category down here is where somebody like William Jennings Bryan was. Animal evolutionary only, not people. Many of the historic evolutionary thinkers like Wallace, I think it was, really sort of got stuck on this point that evolution is something that's only for animals and not necessarily people. In this case, what I say here, it's real but maybe observational. There can be interpretations to this particular group as to what you see in Genesis. But pretty much all the other things are true also. Now when I come down the line here, let me see, I got line 3 here is C.S. Lewis. Basically for those who know him, he wrote Mere Christianity and a number of other books, as well as some of the Narnia books. But basically, for that particular group is okay if all evolution, including people, was due to Darwinian evolution. The fall that you see in Genesis is a poetic description of an actual event. So something actually happened, but it didn't necessarily happen that way in exactly those words. Number 4 here is an important one because this is where the biologos, if you've heard about that, the language of God, thoughts, that's where they tend to come from, where everything is evolutionary. They at least believe in the possibility of miracles. And depending on who you talk to in that group, this could be a poetic description of an actual event or just sort of an allegory about human kind falling. Now, the reason I'm putting this down here like this is you can put these in bins. For people who are not the pure creationists, there's still the idea here, people who are in this category typically look at science as demonstrating God's glory. You go outside and you see the beautiful sky and you say, what a wonderful world that God has made, basically. As you get down here towards the other end, the agnostic and there's some deist categories. And deism is sort of this idea that God created the universe, but then he's off doing other things or not really taking a big part in it. The typical view here is everything that you read in the Bible or the other religious texts is basically a story. Now, these folks typically believe that there is some underlying moral law, but that's a different story. So a good category of a person in this area is Stephen Jay Gould. I don't know if anybody's read any of his work on the separate magisteria or something like that, non-overlapping magisteria. And the idea here is, the concept here is science and faith are talking about two different things. And so you can't use one to prove the other. They're just sort of, I'm a mathematician, so for me what this says is they're orthogonal. They really don't overlap. And that's that particular view. And of course down here at the bottom you have atheism. There's ranges of atheism. And some of them, they feel religion is sort of at best harmless. And you may know that quote, that was Richard Dawkins, I believe, who said that religion is worse than smallpox. So you've got people who fall into all of these categories. But to me, the important thing here to recognize is that it's not just creationists versus atheists. There's a whole range of thinking here that almost like a continuous mix of views of the Bible and views of evolutionary thought. Stephen Jay Gould made an interesting point where he said if you go back, if you really believe that Darwinian theory precludes theistic thinking, then when you look at history, there have been large numbers of believers of any religion who have been involved in paleontology and all this type of stuff. And his point was there would have to be something wrong with those people, cognitive dissonance, if there was actually something that was making these quite different things. So in summary, this trial raised some issues that are still important today. Science versus faith, the type of stuff that we're talking about here. Science versus inerrancy. The Bible is inerrant forever versus science changing over time. The whole issue of teaching of religion versus evolution in the schools. And I would say the results were mixed here. Darrow's side ultimately triumphed in the Supreme Court about 40 years later. But I personally believe Brian's side was better at identifying the risk of unbridled misuse of evolutionary thinking than Darrow's was in warning about the threat of such laws. So the idea that we're going to descend into barbarity didn't really happen. But when you look at some of the things that people have done with misusing evolutionary theory. I think Brian made the better points. There are a number of references here I put at the end that people can go back and look stuff up. There was a fellow at my church who had a biography, Clarence Darrow for the Defense, which was written by Irving Stone, I think, which was a fascinating book to learn about Clarence Darrow. So I guess it's about 8 o'clock, is that right?
That's right.
Okay.